images on the stage, or as we say using churchy words, the chancel, represent our theme for Advent, which is wrapping up Christmas. Rather than talking about how to find meaning in the usual chores and activities of the season, we're looking at the ways Jesus has been introduced in each of the 4 Gospels. Those introductions, even though they were written many years ago, still speak truth to us today. Mark wrote with a sense of urgency because his nation was crumbling around him. Matthew wrote about Joseph because he was talking to Jewish Christians who were unwelcomed, undocumented immigrants in the Roman Empire. And today Luke takes an entirely different direction and focuses on Mary as he introduced Jesus to his audience. Now, Protestant churches don't spend much time with Mary. We know her simply as the mother of Jesus, and we usually think about her when we take the figures out of the nativity box and put them up on the mantle. There is Mary, unwrapped out of her tissue paper in her light blue gown, gazing serenely at her baby. Come on, it's funny. And once the season's over, we wrap her butt up back in tissue paper, put her back in the box, and don't take her out again until next Christmas. To most of us, Mary, the mother of Jesus, really does disappear after Luke's 2nd chapter. And yet, behind that figurine is a real woman. Mary lived a very real life. Luke focused on Mary because his readers led very real lives. Like Mary, Luke's readers were peasants. They were eking out a living, a survival, as a very, very small minority in the Roman Empire. Their lives were hard. And so Mary was someone to whom they could relate. You see, Mary lived in Nazareth, and Nazareth was a small backwater village in the northwestern region of Israel. That region was called Galilee. People who lived there usually worked in the Roman city of Sepphoris. Yes, it's named after the cosmetic company found in all of the major malls. I don't know why. But that city was 4 miles away from Nazareth, and every day Joseph and the other Jewish men would get up early to walk the 4 miles to the city to go to work. Joseph, along with the other buildings, constructed homes there for the Roman soldiers and other mid-level government employees who lived in Sepphoris. Jewish workers were not treated well. They had no unions. In fact, they were treated like slaves. And often, if the Roman employer was unhappy with a glance, a word, a perceived attitude, or the quality of their work, or even the work that they had designed, they would berate the Jewish worker with their words and often would beat them with their fists and their clubs. Sometimes they would beat the Jewish workers to death. So Mary watched the men of her village walk to work to the Roman city every day, and she watched them as they walked those 4 miles home, coming home tired, dusty, sometimes bloodied, and sometimes not at all after a long day's work. Mary grew up knowing life was unfair. She grew up knowing that Rome was powerful. She grew up knowing that she and her family needed to keep Rome happy or they would suffer the consequences. Like all children in the 1st century, Mary started to work as soon as she could walk. Childhood simply did not exist in the 1st century. In fact, childhood didn't become a cherished time of life until the Victorian era, sometime in the 1800s, the 19th century. Children were born to work. They were small adults, and as soon as they were able, they were put to work. So Mary would have sewn clothes, she would have cooked food, she would have cared for the younger children in the village as soon as she was able. Children had to grow up fast because they became adults through a Jewish ritual and eligible for marriage at the age of 13. Mary joined other children in caring for the sheep and goats of the village, and there she experienced birth, death, and animal attacks. She lived in a time when there were few medicines and where giving birth was dangerous, so she was familiar with illness, wounds, death, blood, and the realities of life. As a peasant, she owned one set of clothing, which frankly I can't imagine, but she owned one set of clothing, and her face, her feet, her hands would have often been dirty and dusty because water was precious, and you didn't waste it taking baths. You used it for cooking, for the drinking to keep alive, and for ritual cleanliness. So when the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary, she was probably 13 years old. Her parents had arranged a marriage to Joseph while she was still a child. As a Jewish woman in the first century, Mary knew that she needed a man in her life to give her standing in the community, either her father, a husband, or a son. And her parents cared for her future by betrothing or promising her to an established man in the village while she was still very young. Gabriel came to Mary and told her that she had been chosen by God to be the mother of the Messiah. Gabriel called her blessed. Now Mary knew, being an unmarried, engaged woman who was pregnant by somebody else other than her fiancé, was not that much of a blessing. She knew this pregnancy was going to bring her nothing but trouble. She knew that people in her village would be gossiping and calling her all sorts of insulting names behind her back. She knew her family would fall out of favor. She knew Joseph would be hurt at the least. She also knew that he was a law-abiding Jew, and he was expected to throw the first stone when the village turned out to stone her to death. So Mary knew that she was looking at a difficult time in her life. She knew that the Messiah the angel was talking about would incur the wrath of Rome and the wrath of the temple authorities. She knew he would be misunderstood, and she knew he would be a challenge to raise. And she knew that if he was truly the Messiah, he would most likely die a brutal death at the hands of the temple authorities and the hands of Rome. Mary knew all of this, and she still said yes. She knew all of this was before her, and she still said yes. The people hearing Luke's introduction for the first time heard Mary say yes to God. And they needed that because they were being asked to say yes to God also. Being a Christian in the mid-80s, in the first century of the Roman Empire, subjected them to the same scorn, the same ridicule, and the same danger that Mary faced. Being a Christian in the Roman Empire in the first century was not popular. They were not liked. They lived in poverty. They eked out survival living, and their lives were often difficult. The Christians in the first century needed to hear the angel Gabriel say to Mary, with God, nothing is impossible. In a time when everyone was working as hard as they could to simply survive, the Christians in the first century needed to hear Mary say yes to God. She knew exactly what she was in for, and she still said yes. God speaks to us today, asking us to say yes. As followers of Jesus, we are asked to give Jesus life in our world today. Every day we encounter someone who needs healing, someone who needs hope, someone who needs food or water, someone who needs clothes or shelter. Every day we encounter someone who needs the healing, kindness, love, mercy, forgiveness, and second chances that Jesus offers. Every day we have the opportunity to confront the prejudices in action in our community and our region. Every day we meet someone who needs a shoulder to cry on, a word of encouragement, a fresh start, or a kind word. Every day we are challenged to bring Jesus to life in our world, and every day we have a choice. We can say yes to God, or we can pretend we didn't understand the message. Every day we are invited to say yes. Mary knew exactly what she was in for, and she said yes anyway. She gave life to Jesus, and through him became a blessing to our world. Every time we say yes to God, we too are giving life to Jesus, and through him we can bless our world. But first, we have to say yes. This is the season of preparation. This is the season of preparation where we have the opportunity to prepare our lives, to look at the realities of the world around us, and think about saying yes to God. This is the season when we are asked to open our hearts and our minds and our lives to the risks that come with being a Christian, a real, active, life-giving Christian in our world. To share Jesus with our families, to share Jesus with our neighbors, to share Jesus with our co-workers, to give life to Jesus in our community and in our world. This is the season when we get to prepare our hearts. We are invited to prepare our lives, so when the opportunity comes to give life to Jesus to someone else in our world, we can say yes. And we may live in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. We may live in a community that we think of as God-fearing. We may live in a place and a time where we think it's comfortable to actively be Christian, but still, so often, we don't. This is the time to prepare our hearts. So when the opportunity comes to give life to Jesus, to say, yes, I will do what I can to speak truth to power. Yes, I will do what I can to bring healing to another. Yes, I will do what I can to bring food, shelter, clothing. I will do so. To say, when we are confronted with the opportunity to say no to prejudice, that we are ready. When we have the opportunity to share our faith in our God through actions and as a last resort through words, that we are ready to say yes. Mary knew the dangers. She said yes anyway. And even though I am a Protestant who, like anybody else, takes Mary out of the wrapping and puts her up on the mantle during Christmas time and then puts her away, I think she's quickly becoming one of my heroes. Maybe we too can be heroes to somebody in our world if we say yes to God anyway. Amen.
Amen. Yes.
We have the opportunity to give of ourselves, our time and our talents, and this morning our resources.